and we're worried about the prices going down. The Chinese have made it aware that they're not willing to absorb the cost.
60% of the live lobster here at Deep Cove Ocean Products goes to China, 2.5 million pounds a year. The spring lobster season just around the corner.
The pain is only getting deeper. China is Canada's second largest seafood customer, right after the United States. And now, not steel or oil, but lobsters have become the weapon in a billion-dollar trade war.
So seafood companies on the East Coast are really laser focused now at trying to find other customers for their products to try to ease any pain that could be caused by these tariffs.
Where Canada is cashing in on premium deals while U.S. shipments sit abandoned on the docks. How did America lose control over the very waters that once defined it? Canadians are loving this shift. In just the first half of 2019, they shipped 40% more lobsters to China compared to the same period in 2018. The transformation didn't stop there. When Canada signed the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, with the European Union, it completely rewrote the rules for the lobster trade. Before that deal, both Canadian and American lobsters stood on level ground in Europe. But once CETA came into force, Canadian lobsters entered Europe tariff-free, while Maine lobsters were stuck paying up to 8% in tariffs. That number may look small on paper, but for French restaurants and German wholesalers buying thousands of pounds of lobster, it determined who won and who lost the deal. The effect was swift and brutal. European buyers, always searching for the best combination of quality and price, pivoted almost overnight. Canadian lobsters didn't suddenly taste better or grow bigger. They were simply cheaper, unburdened by tariffs. In an industry where profit margins defined survival, the choice was clear. For Canadian fishermen, it felt like a gift from Ottawa. Generations of families in Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island, who had worked the icy Atlantic waters for decades, were now enjoying higher prices and expanding markets. Harbors filled with boats returning heavy with catches, lobster pounds overflowed, and exporters signed deals with European buyers eager to switch suppliers. A single trade agreement had thrown the doors wide open. But for Maine lobstermen, it was a different reality. They watched their European market share collapse almost overnight. Restaurants in Paris and Madrid that once proudly listed Maine lobster on their menus switched to Canadian imports. For these fishermen, the loss wasn't just economic, it was emotional. They had always viewed Canada as an ally, not a rival tilting the playing field with politics. The sting cut even deeper because this wasn't about fishing skill or product quality. Maine lobsters are world famous for their taste. What Canada had mastered was strategy, using diplomacy to gain the edge. For lobstermen whose families had built their livelihoods over generations, it felt like betrayal. And once those European supply chains shifted to Canada, they became entrenched. Long-term contracts locked in, relationships strengthened, and Canadian lobster became the default choice. This wasn't a short-term win. It was the foundation of long-term dominance. About 20% of U.S. lobster exports once went to China. But when Beijing slapped a 25% tariff on American lobster, the damage grew worse. Lobstering in Maine has always been more than a business. It's a way of life. Families pass down boats, traps, and traditions. In towns like Bar Harbor, Rockland, and Stonington, lobster defines local identity just as much as lighthouses and rocky coastlines. That's why the losses hurt so deeply. For small-scale fishermen already stretched thin, Europe's shift to Canadian lobster was devastating. It meant fewer buyers, smaller profits, and families facing financial insecurity. Communities built around the lobster trade saw money dry up. Local suppliers, processors, and restaurants all suffered. The problem wasn't quality. Maine lobster remained world-class. The problem was politics. Canadian lobster entered tariff-free, while Maine lobster faced barriers it couldn't escape. Maine fishermen accused Canada of winning by bending the rules. Losing to an ally through diplomacy stung more than losing to a distant competitor. This wasn't just about sales, it was about survival. You don't simply find another market for 80 million pounds of lobster overnight. The frustration spilled into politics. Maine candidates couldn't ignore the crisis. Campaign ads showed politicians hauling traps, standing beside lobstermen, and vowing to restore Maine's pride. The lobster trade had become more than economics. It was a symbol of resilience and identity. But Canadian trade moves didn't stop with Europe. When Ottawa secured entry into the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, another door opened. This time, it was Asia, fast-growing markets like Japan, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Canadian lobsters gained preferential access, while U.S. lobsters remained weighed down by tariffs. In Asia, seafood isn't just food. It's tied to culture, luxury, and celebration. Lobster, especially, is a high-status delicacy. With CPTPP, Canadian lobsters reached these markets cheaper, while U.S. lobsters were priced out. The imbalance grew, and by 2021, the numbers spoke clearly. Canada's seafood exports hit $3.26 billion, with lobster making up nearly 37% of that. The U.S. just $459 million. By 2023, Canada's dominance in China was undeniable. Canadian lobsters controlled 76% of the live lobster trade there, leaving the U.S. with only 25%. In cities like Beijing and Shanghai, a lobster from Nova Scotia wasn't just a meal. It was a symbol of prestige, often exchanged as gifts at festivals or business events. Marketing helped too. Canada branded its lobster as fresh, sustainable, and premium. Trade advantages kept supply steady, and buyers locked in long-term. The U.S., meanwhile, found itself shut out of the very markets it once helped define. For Canadian fishermen, this was more than profit. It was pride. Their catch was now a global gold standard. For Maine, it was salt in the wound. Trump saw the anger and seized the symbolism. On campaign stops in Maine, he stood on boats, shook hands, and promised to fight back. He vowed to punish Canada, restore fairness, and reopen European markets. His tough language won applause in fishing towns. But the reality didn't change. Tariffs and agreements were locked in place. European buyers didn't return to Maine lobster. The lobster wars showed the gap between rhetoric and reality. While Trump used lobstermen as symbols of hardworking Americans betrayed by global trade, the structural problem remained. Maine's industry stayed sidelined. Washington then turned to environmental rules as a weapon. U.S. regulators argued that Canadian fishing practices threatened the endangered North Atlantic right whale. Restrictions on Canadian seafood imports followed. But Ottawa pushed back, calling it a disguised trade barrier meant to protect Maine fishermen. Canada countered by doubling down on eco-certifications and branding itself as the sustainable, whale-safe option. The lobster war had shifted from tariffs to environmental credibility. But that was only the beginning. The real storm was still ahead. The moment Trump decided to push tariffs even higher, the market snapped. The Dow tumbled in a single day, oil prices surged overnight, and world leaders rushed into emergency calls. Washington was thrown into chaos, while Beijing hit back with even stronger countermoves. From this point on, it wasn't just about trade anymore. It had turned into a battle for power, and in that battle, every nation was forced to pick a side. The only question left was, whose side would the world choose? If you found this breakdown helpful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and join us as we uncover the events shaping tomorrow. Because here, every story is part of a much bigger journey.